In September 2025, in Kyiv, American historian Timothy Snyder received the Vasyl Stus Prize, a Ukrainian award honoring the name of Vasyl Stus, one of Ukraine's greatest poets and dissidents of the 20th century, killed by the Soviet regime in 1985. Founded in 1989 by Yevhen Sverstiuk, another prominent Ukrainian dissident, the prize is now awarded by PEN Ukraine, the publishing house Dukh Litera, and the Kyiv-Mohyla Business School. Before the award ceremony, we held a public conversation with Snyder on the good and bad ways of thinking about history. Since interpretations of history often lie at the heart of both the good and the evil that people do, this question remains vitally important. This is Thinking in Dark Times, a podcast of reflection from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. Thinking in Dark Times seeks to find the light through and despite today's darkness. I want to thank the Ukrainian History Global Initiative, PEN Ukraine, and the Kyiv-Mohyla Business School for helping organize this event in Kyiv. This episode was made possible with the support of Litera, a Ukrainian NGO dedicated to preparing a new generation of changemakers in Ukraine. You can also listen to several other conversations with Timothy Snyder from previous years. Links are in the description. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to continue our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all relevant links in the episode description. So let's begin. So I would like you to give a huge round of applause to our guest today, Timothy Snyder, please. We are very grateful that Timothy found time to talk to us, and I would like to also to start with also thanking the initiative that he launched with friends and partners, which is called Ukraine History Global Initiative. And thank you for Kyiv-Mohyla Business School that hosts us today. Thank you for Kyiv-Mohyla Academy as such. Thank you to PEN Ukraine, which I also represent, and to UkraineWorld, that you will probably hear this conversation afterwards. Just a little thing that we always, as you might know, we always doing collections for our Ukrainian army, and we bought dozens and dozens of cars for Ukrainian army. We just returned from Zaporizhia region, bringing another one. So now we are collecting for the unit Omega and Kryla Omegi. So you can find a QR code if you want to join it. We'll appreciate it. So we decided to talk about history and the way how people use and abuse history. And I will start, Tim, with a very Nietzschean question. Who wrote this book about advantages and disadvantages of history for life? You criticize very much how history is used both by the Russian propaganda, both by MAGA, both by Trumpists, and by far right and other people. What is the good way to use history to understand who we are, and what is the bad way?
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very glad to be here with you, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk with Volodymyr Yermolenko about important topics. So I will speak in English, because I can make jokes in Ukrainian, I can force my Ukrainian colleagues to work, I can do many things in Ukrainian, but I know that I'm more interesting in English. Therefore, I will reply in English, but I just wanted to greet you in Ukrainian.
So, I'm going to start with the word history, because I think it's a word that we should take care with. I think it's it's a word that deserves our care, because so Volodya, like, anytime anyone expresses a thought about the nature of the world, you probably wouldn't call it philosophy. And so likewise, anytime someone expresses a thought about the past, I wouldn't call it history. So that's where I would begin, that we have to take care of with the word, because the moment we refer to the politics of memory as history, or the moment we refer to national myths as history, the moment we refer to our own personal sense of the past as history, it's at that moment that we lose the word history for anything else. And so we historians find ourselves already pushed into a corner. We're told history is being abused, history is being exploited in certain directions, and our reaction is, wait, that's not history at all. That's something which is taking up the space of history. That's something which is taking away the oxygen of history. So I'll answer the question, but I would begin by making the distinction between history and other uses of the past, just as you might make a distinction between philosophy and other ways of talking about the present or the world or the way things really are or how they should be. And just as, forgive me, a musician might make a distinction between music and every bit of noise there is in the world, or an artist might make a distinction between art and everything we see. So the right way to use the past, I think, is not to use it. The right way to use the past is to recognize that everything that has happened before us is part of us, and to recognize that we have very little idea how that in fact works, and to recognize that the more we learn about the past, the more we are empowering ourselves, and to recognize that the unpredictability of the past is liberating. So I'm a professional historian. I'm probably not a bad one. Every time I do a serious piece of research, I not only find out things that I don't know, I realize that I've asked the wrong questions. And history is like a science in that way. You ask a question, you do some research, you find out you've asked the wrong question. Just like a scientist will have a hypothesis, we'll do some laboratory work and then realize it was a stupid hypothesis and try another hypothesis. That's how we're supposed to work. We eventually get to a place where we have some confidence about some issue, but we have to begin from uncertainty and from reflectiveness, and this is very important, with the capacity for surprise. If you're not surprised by it, it isn't history. So if you buy a book that calls itself history and you read it and it tells you everything you wanted to know, it's not history. The things you want to know are not history. It's the things that you didn't even know how to ask about that are history. It's the things that surprise you that are history. It's the knowledge that someone has generated using scientific methods, brought to you by way of artistic use of language. That's history. So what's wrong with the Putin version or the Trump version is always the same thing. There's no uncertainty, there's no capacity for surprise, there's no richness, there's no depth. Instead, there's certainty about one line of events. And that one line of events imprisons us, because if it is always true that America is great, well then, no matter what we do, it's great. And everyone else has to admit it. And we can't question it. And if we can't question it, then we're not free. Or if Russia was always part of Ukraine, then nothing bad is happening when Russia invades Ukraine. So the single line to the past is always, in a very literal sense, not in a metaphorical sense, in a very literal sense, takes our freedom away. So what's wrong with it isn't just that it isn't true. So I can spend a lot of time explaining why America wasn't so great in the 1950s or the 1920s. I can also spend a lot of time explaining why Russia and Ukraine weren't together in the year 862 AD. I can explain that. It's wrong in a factual sense, but it's more deeply wrong in that it's not history at all. It's a story which gives the teller of the story power over the rest of us.
I recently had a conversation with Yaroslav Hrycak, and I used as a philosopher the word always, and he said there are two words that are prohibited among historians, is always and never, which is of course a very bad news for philosophers, because while I have a joke that while history is thinking about what happened there and then, and journalism is about what's happening here and now, so philosophers is about what's happening always and everywhere, which is of course not true, because it's too pretentious, but still there is...
Like, I can help though, I can help. Philosophy is about what happens never and nowhere.
That's right. I will think about this, yeah. So, I really like this idea of an unpredictability. I think it opens a lot, and we have talked about it when we were talking about your book about freedom. But at the same time, I really like the way how people were approaching history in the, let's say, pre-modern times. And this famous phrase, historia magistra vitae, and I really like how, for example, philosophers as the Stoics or Montaigne or some others, they were actually using history as examples, as moral examples. They basically were saying, okay, people are the same everywhere, and these people like 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago, they did this. And this is kind of an example of bravery that we need to repeat, and this is a lesson for us. Why I'm asking you this? Because, for example, if we say that history is unpredictable, then how we can learn from it? And you do a lot of work to teach people to learn a little bit. Like you're saying, if we are going into this populism that we are going today, then fascism is inevitable. And you use the word fascism, which some might say is a very historically rooted in, Italy of the 1920s. But then when you use the word fascism to, for example, to designate some of the trends in the global politics today, you mean that probably history is predictable. Then if you see some signs that can lead to very bad things, and I think your book on tyranny is precisely about that, is about warning. So how history can be unpredictable, but at the same time teach us and serve as a warning for us?
That's a good question. I think the tension is apparent, though, rather than real, because the unpredictability has two parts. The first is that even when there is good reason to believe that there is a trend in a certain direction, human affairs or our interaction with the world is so complicated that things just turn up, which change everything. So if it's September 10th, 2001, and the people in Logan Airport in Boston are a little bit more careful at the baggage control, then there isn't a massive terrorism event in the United States the next day. We never invade Iraq. And it's a very different world that we live in. And of course, there are big trends that you could say, once 9/11 happens, the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 happens, you can point to big trends that are somehow consistent with that event. But at the end of the day, there were also small things that had to go a certain way, right? And one can multiply the examples of that. Hitler was very nearly assassinated. in November 1939. I mean, a matter of meters. Someone left an explosive, and the explosive went off, but he decided to leave early for the next event. And so it missed him, not by a matter of meters, I should say a matter of minutes. It missed him, I think, by 45 minutes. If he's killed in 1939, Germany would have probably remained far-right, nationalist, fascist, whatever, but it's extremely unlikely that the next German government would have undertaken the Second World War in the same form that the Second World War was undertaken. And so then the whole history of, for example, Ukraine would have been very different. So there are these contingencies which are just beyond our ability to predict. And I also think beyond the machine's ability to predict. That's one side of it. But the other side of it is that we are, or at least can be, unpredictable. And our ability to be unpredictable, I think, depends in part on our ability to see into the gaps, our ability to see what's possible and what's not possible. And so here I'm turning towards your view and saying there are ways that we can apply history. If we have a sense of what's more likely and less likely, if we can recognize patterns from the past, then we are more likely to be able to exercise our own will. We are going to be more likely to exercise events. So exercise our will on events. So to take an extreme, and this is a view I hear a lot, nothing in the past matters. So if you think nothing in the past matters, then everything that happens is new and surprising and shocking. And so when it happens, you say, this is new, I am surprised and shocked, and therefore helpless. And not only helpless, but I have an excuse for my helplessness, because of course nothing like this has ever happened before. So that's the extreme. But if you know more things about history, then when a shocking or surprising things happened, of course you're a little surprised or a little shocked, but you can recognize it. In fact, you can even recognize your own shock and surprise as part of a historical process. So history liberates us in that way by making the unfamiliar of the present always a little bit more familiar, and in that way it helps us to become more free. So history, it goes back in a way to your first question. What's wrong with the way a dictator uses the past is a dictator says there's only one line of events, and therefore you must be on that line. You cannot be anywhere else. Whereas if we know that history involves a lot of different lines, a lot of different possibilities, but that some bundles, some combinations are more likely than others, then we can be prepared. So for example, there was a fairly major political assassination in the United States yesterday, was it? I've been very busy and a lot's been going on. If you know anything about history, you know that it's not a certain, it's not inevitable, but it's very likely that this will be exploited politically in a certain way. And if you know that it's going to be exploited politically, you can talk about how it's going to be exploited politically in advance, and therefore make it less likely that those who want to exploit it politically will succeed in doing so. So, I mean, that's how I would reconcile it, that the fact that if history were predictable, then we would be predictable and we couldn't be free. But the fact that it's unpredictable means that those of us who learn more about the past become better at seeing patterns, and in seeing patterns, we then have the freedom to try to nudge things in one direction or another. And I wanted to take your point that it's legitimate, and it's been done well in the past, to look for patterns in history, to take history as a source of imagination rather than constraint.
My next question will go in this direction, because I would rather ask how different epochs view the past. And I will give you a very simplified example. I think one of the key revolutions of the 19th century, of the Romanticism, is to say that people of the past are us. We are basically identical with the people of the past. You see that in German Romanticism, you see that in French Romanticism, you obviously see that in Ukrainian Romanticism, when basically Ukrainian Romantics
like, of course, Shevchenko and Kulish and Kostomarov were looking in the past and were saying, okay, the Haidamakis are us. This is the same people with the same fight. And in a way, this 19th century developed this idea that history is one thing, just, like Hegelian or something like that, right? Or Marxian, if you want. But then the 20th century comes, and you see in the 20th century a lot of schools that are saying, no, history is like a foreign land. Like if I think about l'École des Annales in France, they were approaching Middle Ages like, these are the aliens. We need to go from an assumption that people in the Middle Ages thought, behaved, acted completely differently, and we need to apply this idea of complete difference, and only in this way that we will understand them. And I basically think that both approaches are wrong. What is your idea about this? Because why I'm asking, because it comes to your argument like, okay, the problem of the Russian narrative, besides the fact that it is basically justifying killings and cruelty and all the horrors, is that it is wrong because we do not have like Rus is not Russia. It's not the same thing, right? But at the same time, another idea is like, people living in these lands, like in the early modern times, are completely different, and we cannot say that they have a connection, for example, with Ukrainian identity, or Rus is something very, very different, or Scythians, or I don't know, Tripilians, or whatever. It's probably also wrong, this idea of total difference. How can we find a balance here?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I'm going to extend the premise a little bit before I answer. With the Romantics, or with the 19th century, yes, what they were saying was something like, the people in the past are like us, except that we are facing this complicated modernization process, which is contaminating us and diluting us, and we have to, in some sense, we have to resist modernization and complication. We have to remember who we truly are. And from that it followed that we have to undertake rituals like writing poetry or seances or interpreting dreams or whatever it might be in order to get back in touch with who we truly are. And who we truly are in the Romantic imagination is not a historical self, it's an unchanging, unblemished national or folk self. So it's a vision of the past, but it's not a historical vision of the past. And then I take your point about alienation from past peoples as well. The past is another country, but like
I am now in another country, and I can communicate with you, though imperfectly, but you will understand me, and I will understand you.
The people in the past are there not to be abused, but to be understood. And it's going to sound very simple, but in trying to understand people from the past, you understand yourself better. Just like when you try to understand another country, you understand yourself better. And so certainly people in the past were different, but the historian will say, not to the point of incomprehensibility. And a good historian, I think, will say, you try to keep encountering people in the past over and over and over again by way of whatever sources are available. And Isaiah Berlin would make the point, and I believe he's right, that the attention and the talent that goes into that investigation are essentially human forms of attention and talent. That is, even when we're reading in a different language about a people who no longer exist, the way that we are engaging them, imagining them, is human. And insofar as we succeed, it's because we, in fact, find the pulse, find the harmony, hit the rhythm, somehow, to some extent, of those other people. And history is only possible, and here I'm really just repeating Isaiah Berlin, history is only possible not just because we have the sources, but because we have that human capacity for, let's call it empathy. We have that human capacity to reach out and find something that comes back to us, and which is human and which is true. So yes, people in the past are different. And I would add to that, the difference of people in the past is one of the liberating elements of history. It's one of the liberating elements, because when you recognize that people in the past were different, you're recognizing that there are different ways of organizing yourselves as human beings. And we in the present, I think, are extremely arrogant about the forms of social and political organization that we have. We tend to imagine that they're better in every respect than all other forms of social and political organization, or we just can't imagine very different forms of social and political organization. We have a kind of, we have the sort of, there's an arrogance that's inherent in the present, right? 50 years from now, if any of us are still alive, we will also think that the forms of political and social organization we have are better. Just like 50 years ago, people thought the same thing. But when you seriously engage with the past, you realize actually in some ways the way they did things was better. And you also find yourself led very often to the thought, which is a difficult thought to process, that people in the past were probably in many ways more capable and more intelligent than we are, which turns the tables on us a little bit, because whether we're romantic or whether we're a social scientific historian of the 20th century, we in some sense think we have the angle on the people on the past, right? We're looking back on them, but we're also looking down on them. And at a certain point, you look down on them for long enough and you realize that the eyes looking back at you are not beneath you, they're somewhere else. And that if they were investigating you, they might figure you out faster than you're figuring them out. And if they were dropped into your society, they would probably adapt to it faster than you would adapt to their society. And thoughts like that, I find, are very liberating. They provide you with they shake you. They give you a sense that intellectually I'm alive. Something has just happened. And so the difference of people in the past doesn't have to be just a barrier. It can be a tissue, or it can be a filter, it can be a spectrum through which we don't see everything, but some colors come through, and the colors allow us to see ourselves differently.
Let me ask something about Ukrainian history, because you're doing a lot for the world to understand better Ukrainian history, but also for us, ourselves, Ukrainians, to understand ourselves better. And well, for a typical, very kind of common sense, people tend to think about Ukrainian history from the medieval times, Rus and everything, Christianization. People who tend, think about Ukrainian literature, they tend to think about Ukrainian literature from the 18th century or 19th century, which is, of course, totally wrong. But then you are somebody who is introducing a lot deeper vision of the Ukrainian history. You talk about the Greek connection, you talk about Scythians, you talk about the deeper layers, the Tripilians and everything. And actually, in the Ukrainian intellectual culture, it's present. It's very present. Look at how Hrushevsky starts the Ukrainian history. He starts very, very deeply. Look at those people like, I don't know, Malanyuk or somebody else who really interested. Or I was thinking once, well, in which other culture one of the best writer is actually archaeologist? I mean Petrov Domontovich. So, and for him, the idea that the most interesting part of Ukrainian history is actually underground, is in archaeology, is a very important thought. But when we're dealing with this part of history, what can we learn actually, and what do you want to learn? Because we are much more kind of lacking the written sources. We lack those things that are much easier probably to interpret. So when you try to go deeper into the deeper past of Ukrainian history, what do you want to know? What do you want to learn?
This is a really good question, and I want to start by pausing and dwelling on part of Volodya's premise, because it's so very important. Mikhailo Hrushevsky, the founder of Ukrainian historiography, one of the early social historians, one of the founders of social history as such, he got some important things wrong, but he got some important things right. And as Volodya says, when you read Volume 1, it's striking how many of the debates that he enters into are still going on with the same stakes. So Hrushevsky, for example, engages with a debate about the place of origin of the Indo-European languages, a debate that had been going on for some time and is going on to the present day, although, as I'll say in a minute, I think it's actually pretty close to being settled. And it is very important to take the point that Volodya makes. I worry a little bit that there's a kind of conspiracy of, let's say, ethnic nationalism and constructivism, where like each of those two things probably thinks that they're very different from the other. You know, very few constructivists walk around saying, actually, I'm an ethnic nationalist, and very few ethnic nationalists walk around saying, actually, I'm a constructivist. But what they have in common is the habit of turning the past into something which is very recent and which has limits. So if you're a constructivist, not that your constructivists are wrong about everything. Constructivist insights about the nation are very useful and certainly have informed my work. But if you take the position to the extreme, then you wind up with the view that the nation is very recent and it's a result of willful human action. It could have gone many other ways. It's essentially, you know, it's meaningless because it could have happened some other way. Now, and also the other thing is the deep past doesn't matter. If you're a constructivist, you generally say, look, somewhere, you know, on September 17th, okay, I'm parodying, I'm sorry, I can't help myself. On September 17th, 1892, a group of Ukrainian intellectuals got together, and during a break in their card game, they invented the Ukrainian nation. Okay. But see, what I'm trying to say is that what ethnic nationalists do is actually very similar. Because ethnic nationalists, they say, of course, well, we're an ethnos, we're a folk, we've been here forever. But their notion of forever, it turns out, only goes back a few decades, right? Their notion of the heroes of the Ukrainian past only goes back to the middle of the 20th century. Maybe as far back as the late 19th century. And so then somehow you find yourself with the same set of Ukrainian intellectuals. Maybe they're not playing cards. Maybe they're in Siberian prison or whatever. But you find yourself with the same limit to history. For the ethnic nationalists and for the constructivists, it only goes back to the last quarter of the 19th century. And then there's nothing else. And for Ukrainians, that's a huge mistake. A huge mistake. Not just because the history of the nation itself goes much further back, which in my view it does. In my view, the history of the Ukrainian nation and self-conscious reflection about mass politics should be dated from the period between the Union of Lublin and the Khmelnytsky uprising. So, 450 years ago, roughly. But that's not the real mistake. The real mistake is to say, we're going to set a limit on history, and that limit is modernity. And modernity is not the limit of your history. Logically speaking, whoever you became in the fourth quarter of the 19th century, or whoever you are now, depends on everything that happened before. Everything. And both the constructivists and the ethnic nationalists, I'm sorry I keep pointing to you, ethnic nationalists, and maybe, I don't know. But
you can point at myself on both examples.
Okay. Yes, exactly. Yeah. This has been a bad long thing for Volodya. But in both cases, what happens is that you're restricting the discussion to modernity, But modernity can only happen because of the things that happened before modernity. And there's a certain, mathematical logic which is worth taking into account. We tend to think that everything that happened, like what happened today depended on what happened yesterday, right? Yesterday is very important to us. And what happened tomorrow is going to depend on what happened today. We interact with the news sort of day by day, right? And we live in this very narrow present. But the truth of the matter is that the way you experience tomorrow is much more dependent on the first 5 years of your life than it is on today. You don't remember the first 5 years of your life, but that's when the important things happened. And history is a little bit like that. The past is a little bit like that. The fact that we don't remember it or even have written sources doesn't mean that it wasn't incredibly important. So yes, the history of the nation is important for Ukrainians, but it's not the only thing that's important for Ukrainians. And you have to be very careful to be aware that, yes, once national politics start, it started at a certain time. We can debate when, Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's not in around 1630 or 40. Maybe it's 1830 or 40. Maybe it's 1930 or 40. But whenever it was that it started, there was something before that. And the something before that is very significant for what kind of national politics you have. The nation doesn't come along and give you a fresh start. A nationalist might want you to think so, that all you are is your ethnicity or something, and that therefore the details of the past don't matter. But again, notice how close that is to a radical constructivist position, right? You don't have to know the details of the past because the nation was just invented at a certain point by essentially random intellectuals. What I want to say is that the deep past matters very much. Going back to the analogy of your early life, we're not going to have a Freudian therapy session where I now try to, elicit from you what happened in your early childhood. But we have better methods than Freudian methods to do the past. And this is where I want to start answering your question. The technology, okay, so those of you who have read my work know that I'm not necessarily a friend of technology when it's applied to the present and the future. We have many things to worry about, including climate change and the colonization of our cognitive abilities by social media. I am very concerned about these things. Ironically, the place where high technology, truly high technology, is very significant in making us smarter. It's not the future. It's not even the present. I have bad news about the present. We're much stupider than we used to be. Yes, and at some point you cross the line where you no longer realize that's true. And then you're really in trouble. The place where technology makes us smarter, much smarter, is the past, and especially the deep past. So I'm a modernist. I mainly still work with written sources, but I am very appreciative of how certain kinds of technology have enlivened the past and have made things visible that weren't visible before. And these are spectacularly interesting things with direct relevance to the history of Ukraine. So I'll give you a fun example, and then I'll give you two deeply serious examples. A fun example are the Amazons. So, if you watch superhero movies, the only Amazon in your life is probably Wonder Woman. If you are aware of Greek mythology, you probably think, well, yes, the Greeks somehow had a thing about women who fought in battles. And throughout the 20th century, the dominant interpretation of the Amazons in Greek art was, well, Freudian, that the Greeks had a problem with women. Their own women were constrained to conventional domestic tasks, and therefore they fantasized about women who could ride horses and do battle. It has a certain plausibility to it, but it's not true. And how do we know it's not true? Because Ukrainian archaeologists in digs in Ukraine have found dozens and dozens and dozens of sites in which very, very, very many biologically female remains can be found with weapons and armor. Roughly 1/5 of the Scythian era burials of armed human beings are women. Now, how do we know they're women? Because of course, and this is very interesting about us. For much of the 20th century, many people looked on those remains and they said, these are small men. These are small men with unusual pelvic development. And you can debate this for a long time until the actual tech comes along and you scrape the bones and you get the DNA, and then you can say with certainty, you can't say with certainty how those people thought about themselves, I hasten to add, but you can say with certainty that these were biological females. And so then suddenly the entire debate changes. The entire interpretation of Greek art has to change. The entire tradition where Hercules and Theseus and Perseus and Achilles all engage with Amazons begins to look a bit different, right? The entire tradition where Amazons appear in the Iliad, they don't appear in the Iliad, sorry, they appear in a different tradition, the Ethiopica. But the entire idea that the Amazons appear in the Trojan Wars, the fact that Amazons are the single most popular motif in Greek ceramics, all of that looks different when you realize, in fact, they were engaged regularly with female archers on horseback who killed them. Once you know that, then everything looks different. And that's just that's a single example of how tech ends a debate, right? And if we're in the deep prehistory of Ukraine, to which Volodya is referring, the Tripilia, okay. The Tripilia around Uman, around 6,000 years ago, built settlements which we now call Nebelivka, Talianki, Maidanske, which at the time were the largest urban agglomerations in the world. And not only big, but interesting, because built on a very different pattern than the cities of Mesopotamia. The other old cities, so there are two models of ancient cities. There's the European one, Ukrainian one, and it's European is Ukrainian because nowhere else in Europe are there any cities anywhere near this big. So there's the European model, which has semicircular rows of houses and a few larger, what they call lodges, and a big gathering area in the middle, which of course to the Ukrainian imagination is irresistible because you say, aha, that's where we protest. But however you interpret this topography, this urban topography, it's very different from the Mesopotamian model, which is built in stone with walls with visible concentrations of power. There are no visible concentrations of power in Nebelivka, Talianki, and Maidanske. So we can't say for sure how it worked, but it definitely worked differently than Mesopotamia. And that fires the imagination. Going back to the earlier question, it reminds us that there are multiple lines of history. There are different ways that humans can organize themselves. How do we know all of this? Those cities that I'm talking about are farmland now. They're plowed under. You cannot see them with your eyes. You can see them. They were first spotted by a pilot, and then you can dig in, so to speak, with LiDAR, with a form of radar technology. You can date things. So these cities weren't built in stone; they were built with organic materials. You can date them now with advanced carbon isotope dating. And with the help of modern technology, you can actually get a very good sense of how these things looked, how they were built, what they looked like, and then begin to think of how they functioned. Or take the slightly later question of when did Hrushevsky writes about this? When did the Indo-European languages arise? So like the question of the first cities, the question of the Indo-European languages is a first-rate, I mean, maybe the single most important, one of the most important historical questions. Where our languages come from has been debated for, 2,000 years at least. The specific question of the Indo-European homeland, which is the site of the languages which you speak, all the Slavic languages, all the Germanic languages, the Romance languages, Indian languages, Iranian languages, the languages spoken by almost 1/2 of the world right now. It's been clear since the 19th century that there's a homeland for these languages because we can chart similarities in the use of words. And I won't bore you with how this all works, but it's clear that they all came from one place, but just where is hard to say. And again, as with the Amazons and their bones, you can make arguments. So there's pretty good archaeological evidence having to do not just with humans, but with domesticated animals that points to Ukraine. There's pretty good linguistic evidence that points to Ukraine. But it remains debatable, quite debatable, until you have ancient DNA technology. But once you have ancient DNA technology, you can start to chart where people are from and where they moved and how they spread their genes. And if you read, so this is stuff which is apparently far away from Ukraine. The people who write about it don't necessarily use the word Ukraine, but if you look on the pages of Science magazine and Nature magazine, the two most prestigious scientific journals in the world, for the last 10 years, and actually in the last few months, there's been a proliferation of articles based on ancient DNA evidence concluding that the origin of the Indo-European languages is the Ukrainian steppe. So technology so again, this, I have to attach qualifications to this. It is, of course, still being debated, but modern technology is pushing us in some pretty clear directions with respect to very basic issues. And these very basic issues often have to do with Ukraine. So just to finish, if we know more about the big cities, if we know more about the language, so if you know that Ukrainian is a language which is descended from a language which is 6,000 years old and began somewhere right here, or probably closer to Dnipro. I was in Dnipro a few days ago, and so I was saying, right here, I think it was right here, Dnipro. But probably closer to Dnipro, probably on that side, probably on the east side of the Dnipro River. Somewhere right around here, though, if you know that somewhere right around here is the source not only of your language, but of the languages spoken by half the world, that makes your language, that makes the everyday use of your language something different, perhaps, than it was before. And for me, that's just the beginning. The Yamna, who are probably the people who brought the Indo-European languages out of Ukraine, the Tripilya, they're just the beginning. Each layer after that, the Scythians, the Goths, the Rus, bring spectacularly interesting factual material about these lands and about their connection to the world. And so I'm not Ukrainian, right? I'm not interested in this because I'm Ukrainian.
We start doubting this.
Yeah. No. I mean, that's...
I can say this because I am not Ukrainian. If a Ukrainian says, yes, all the languages of the world come from Ukraine, or the great cities, old cities come from Ukraine,
then I'm a crazy Ukrainian nationalist.
And constructivist at the same time.
At the same time, right. You actually can't, well, the two of them go very closely together. But my point is that I don't find this interesting because I'm Ukrainian. I find it interesting because it's interesting. And if I were a Ukrainian, I wouldn't want to let that go, right? The layers of human history that you have on these lands are incredibly dense and rich. Incredibly dense and rich. I wouldn't want to let that go.
I wonder how many people after this meeting will become archaeologists and DNA analysts, or maybe Amazons, we don't know. Maybe my last question, I will ask the last question, and I will pass the floor to the audience. It's It's a question actually of how people in the world perceive history. I have the impression that in the intellectual culture of the 20th and early 21st century, the idea is that basically history has already happened. And we are living in a kind of a post-history. And I'm not meaning Fukuyama, by the way. I mean many other people. For example, in Europe, this mythology that basically the war is in the past. Because history is very often about tragedies and about conflicts and about something very, very, very tragic. I really like the idea how, for example, your teacher, Tony Judd, framed the history of Europe as a post-war. It seems that this is a metaphor that defines Europe still today, as if Europe is living in a world that it seems that all what Europe is good about is about the post-war. It's about that the war is in the past and history is in the past. And in a way, ways of making history resembled me of ways of saying, okay, look how bad people were in the past. We know that it will never happen. Do you have this impression? And do you see people, other types of people, which I'm, for example, very interested in? That is a type of people, authors, historians, philosophers, writers, who have a very deep sense of history, not of the past, but of history that is going today. In Ukrainian context, I'm thinking about Lesya Ukrainka, whom we love, both of us and many people in this room, I'm sure. In the European context, I'm thinking about people like Nietzsche, or people like Stefan Zweig, or maybe somebody else. Do you see these kind of people coming back that really sense that history is not in the past, that history is going through our bodies? And please think about your questions after Tim's answer.
So I have a few thoughts about that, and I'm going to connect them to some of your other questions. It's great fun to talk about technology and archaeology, and what I've just described is all true, and it's the knowledge about these early cities and the knowledge about Indo-European. It's specialist knowledge which is still seeping out into the world. But when we talk about, I don't want to make it all sound so easy, because it depends upon access. In the end, it depends upon access to land, and the heritage that you have, whether you think of it as national heritage or not, is constantly being stolen by Russians. Some of the most beautiful and important Scythian ornaments, relics that we have, if were stolen from Kherson. And everywhere the Russians occupy is a place that Ukrainians can't dig. And a lot of Ukrainian digging has quite literally been disrupted by the invasion in Crimea and also in the east. Volodya kindly mentioned Ukrainian History Global Initiative, which is a big project that I'm helping to organize, where we are trying to put emphasis on the early periods and support the early periods and support the archaeologists. And last night we had our public event, and it went very well. It went very well. I don't want to tell. The story is not tragic. It was good, but when we were in the middle of one of the archaeology panels, there was one of the alerts came through, and so we stopped the event halfway. And that was we found a way to begin again, and everything was fine. But that was, in a very simple way, symbolic of the problems that archaeologists are having. In a narrow way, they have the problem that the war makes their work much more difficult. In a slightly broader way, the fact that we're living in a world of war means that people often have a hard time understanding, why is the past so important? Why is it important that we have museums or digs? Why must we think about the past in terms of the present? And this brings me back to an answer to your first question, which I want to return to. When people think about the past, they don't need to have a fully conceived, coherent view. I don't think that's necessary. Lesya Ukrainka did not, in fact, have that. What people can sometimes have, which helps them, is a bit of clarity and truth about something, right? So when I was like, so I've done a fair amount of visiting soldiers and talking to them, and a word that I hear a lot, maybe surprisingly, but is the word kultura, right? And by kultura, they don't, I mean, I'm not going to say what every one of them means or say that they all mean the same thing, but they don't seem to mean I, as a Ukrainian soldier, need to have a completely coherent up and down account of everything in Ukrainian history. What they mean is more like, I want to know more about a bit of music, or I want to know more about a bit of costume, or I want to know more about these Cossacks, I want to know more about this song. I want to have something which is beautiful and true, some piece, right? Not necessarily the whole thing, but some piece. And that I find completely comprehensible, because even if you're a professional historian, your pieces might be big, they might be a book, but they're still only a piece, right? They're a piece that you try to make beautiful and true. So I get that, and I find that very sympathetic. And we can, one thing that we should be trying to do is make sure that people have access to bits of things, even if we can't give them the whole thing. And of course, it's in, and this goes back to your question about recognizing patterns. A pattern recognition is seeing a bit of history in a way which is true and instructive. It's at like that moment of insight where you know enough that somehow you get the rhythm of the thing, and then you realize, aha, that rhythm of the thing is relevant to what's going on now. So your question, of course, leads to the war, and it's not that, I like the way you put it, because it's not that this war repeats other wars. It's similar in many ways to the First World War, sadly. It's similar in many ways to the Second World War, sadly. But it doesn't repeat things. There are aspects of it that you can understand better. But it's not even necessarily about understanding. It's about, I think the question is more relevantly, pertinently about those moments of recognition where you see, aha, someone was in a similar predicament. Someone had a similar thought. From the buildings around me, or the situation I'm in, or the conversation I'm having with my friends, I suddenly realize I see things lining up. And you get this, I mean, one can say, one certainly gets this from a lot of the poetry that's being written by people in the field. And of course, I mean, one, just to close on a very poignant and pretty, I think, very clear example, Vika Amalina's essay, Nothing Bad Has Ever Happened Here, where at a certain moment she saw Lviv in a way she hadn't seen it before. And she recognized that her city, which she thought she understood naturally, she was reading Stanisław Lem, I think, and she suddenly realized, okay, here in Lviv, all sorts of things have happened, terrible things, and now they've lined up so that I understand them, and I'm inside not just the city that I always thought I knew, but the city which has suddenly become unfamiliar and therefore more real. And because I understand it, I'm therefore responsible in some way. Not totally, but I'm responsible in some way. And I mean, one reason I'm glad to be here, and one reason it's very fulfilling for me to be here among my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, is that I have that sense about a lot of people around here, that it's not that they think the past is repeating. If the past repeats, then none of us is responsible. If things simply repeat on their own, we can't be responsible. But if the past helps us to see how something works, then we can't help but think, I'm inside of that something now, and the fact that I've seen it means that I'm in some way responsible.
Thank you. Questions?
Hello, my name is Igor Belyan. I'm also a professional historian. I'm very glad to be here. And my main research interests are post-colonialism, global history, and I was researching British Empire in the Caribbean. I know it sounds very exotic for a Ukrainian historian to research such a topic, but my question is about memory policy in the US. And during recent years, we've seen a lot of discussions about US policy towards Indians and 1614 project. And what do you think about the current memory policy in the US and what we can learn in Ukraine from American experience? Thank you.
It's very nostalgic to be asked what you can learn from America. That's like, it's like, brings me back to the good old days. I know you didn't mean the question in a naive way. It's striking, you know. I mean, at least, yeah. Okay, I'm going to try to stay away. I wanted to take the opportunity of your question to pick up an aspect of one of Volodya's questions, which I dropped, which is about memory. So, of course, in my view, when we're talking about state policies about the past, they're usually not about history. They're usually about, let's call it memory, or they're about some kind of official version of the past. The state, sadly, very rarely encourages history as such, right? It encourages certain versions. And going back to Volodya's question about post-war, or the notion of being beyond things, as I look at it now, I tend to think that the replacement of history by memory tends to lead to two poles. One pole is, as I think you were suggesting, helplessness. Because if our whole identity is based upon the fact that we've already learned everything from the past, then when something happens in the present, we're pretty hopeless. And that is a problem for Europe today. That is a problem for Germany today, as you and others have pointed out for quite some time. It is a problem for Germans when they think we learned all the correct lessons from war. And then what happens if 80 years later there's another war and the situation is a bit different, and the lessons that you've learned turn out to have much more to do with your own internal history than with what even actually happened in 1941? You're stuck. And that's a general problem, and the Americans had that problem too after 2022. That we weren't as bad as the Germans, but even at our best, which is unfortunately not very good lately, but even at our best, we couldn't really grasp that there was a real war going on right now in the real world. And that, going back to another of your questions, that means that we are in history. We're not in memory, we're not in bureaucracy, we are in history. And what we do or don't do in March, April, May of 2022 is going to have consequences for years, decades, centuries. And that is our responsibility, whether we like it or not. That is a moment I remember incredibly intensely. March and April of 2022, when I was trying to tell Americans who mattered that the only relevant category is victory, that wars are won or they're lost. And although you may not be able to think about it right now, this war is going to be won or lost. And this may actually be a moment, even though it doesn't appear to be a moment, where what you do could lead to a victory. And I have to say, I feel that even more strongly now than I did at the time. Those weeks were history was calling us, and we didn't hear the call. We were still too much in memory. So one pole is helplessness, and the other pole is ruthlessness, where if it's not about history, like if history is over, then all that's left, and again, this is a funny place where the far left and the far right tend to meet, but all that's left is a story. All that's left is a story, and your story might be that there was a guy called Rurik, and somehow Rurik, when he was dying, had a baby, and somehow his cousin or kinsman or whatever, Oleg, smuggled that baby into Kyiv, and somehow that means that Kyiv, even though it wasn't really settled by the Rus then, is the same as Novgorod, even though Novgorod hadn't even been founded at the time and didn't exist. And therefore, like, this means that more than 1,000 years later, Russia and Ukraine, like, it's a story, right? It's a story. And if all that's left is story, if we're past history and all that's left is story, that's a story, right? And if your view is truth doesn't matter and facts don't matter, and what matters is the coherence and power of a story, well, it's apparently a coherent and powerful story. So, if it's a story, you can be ruthless about a story, because a story can't be corrected. You know, the story has a teller, and so long as the teller is in power, the story can't be corrected. It has its own logic. And unlike history, which has to adjust, when you kill people in the name of a story, it just makes the story more true. Story can't be disproven by blood. It can only be confirmed by blood. So this brings me to your question. As I tried to say in response to Volodya's very first question, if it's history, that means that it's always a little uncomfortable. And if it's history, that means that it enables you to hear voices that you weren't hearing before. So our memory policies are largely set locally. We can talk about what Trump says about the past, and they have certainly taken big steps towards trying to undo policies that were directed towards correcting historical injustices. And they clearly have a funny view about the past, which is that only white guys ever made history, which is a strange view. I mean, I have to say, as a white guy, it's a strange view, because, like, I know a lot of white guys, and I really wouldn't want to leave the past, the present, or the future to them alone in any event, like, especially when they get together in groups. Sorry, these are very American remarks. I mean, race is we have our own special understanding of race. But so in general, the way American memory policy is set, as I'm sure you know, is by the states. It's not by the central government, it's by the states. And in many states, there are now laws to the effect that the way the past is taught can't be upsetting to anyone. And of course, this is very troubling, because let's face it, the past is upsetting to everyone. I mean, if you know anything about the past, you're going to be upset by something in the past. And if it's not upsetting to you, then it's not history, obviously. But the specific way that it works in my country is that the idea is that it's not supposed to upset you if you're a white person. So you're not supposed to be taught about slavery, because if you were taught about slavery, that might upset you because you might feel responsible, right? And so therefore those topics have to be taboo, because the little children might be upset, and we can't have that. Now, you can see how racialized this is. I can pick out who's from the US Embassy, by the way, when I talk like this. You can try to disguise yourselves if you want now, but you've already been exposed. But of course, the way that this is racial is that no one is asking, well, are the black kids upset when we don't talk about slavery, right? And of course they are, but that's not the issue. Like, the way that it's all racial is that we have to make sure that some people are not upset, and we don't ask who is upset. So, I mean, my view of history teaching in the U.S. is that we have way too much censorship. We have way too many scared teachers. We have way too many teachers. I mean, this is a way my country, unfortunately, is worse than your country. We have way too many teachers who have been fired, who have been fired, or who have resigned because they can't teach a curriculum which has been imposed on them in this way. So yeah, I mean, my view of U.S. history is that, like everybody's history, it's a challenge. And if you're not facing the challenge, you're not doing history. The big issue in my country's history, it's not the one we're especially good at talking about to other people, but the place of the analogy of Holodomor in our history is slavery. And if you can't get that central issue right, or if you look away from it, or if you don't admit that there are local perpetrators, you can't get very far. And so we've taken, in my view, we've taken big steps backwards in the last few years, and it makes me sad to think that we're trying to raise children who aren't challenged by history. So that's my view on it.
Thank a lot for this discussion. My name is Mykola Skiba. I'm a cultural manager and cultural anthropologist as a background. And I have some speculative question because we talk a lot about some extreme in the approach of the history. In one hand is storytelling, in the other hand technology. Because special technique, for example, gene analysis, etc. Imagine some impossible. The rise of machine happen, and we have shift of paradigm. Have dataism as a state ideology, and shift of the approach how we use history, and instead of storytelling, we approach history as a huge database, as a storage of that raw data. In some sense, it's possible even now without rise of machine, because we have a data science of imagine some shift happen. Instead of classic university, the history study, the computer scientist became new historian. What is effect it might happen if we take the history as much as possible without emotional relation? We still emotion for our cultural experience, imagine, but we study history through the data. Imagine this situation. What might happen? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Volodya referred to 20th century historians who were of a very similar mind. I mean, there were historians who thought of history as a social science where data, quantitative data, is very important. And quantitative data is very important. Numbers are very important. So just to take a very simple and familiar example, it matters a lot whether 10,000 people were starved in Ukraine in 1932 or 1933, or 3.9 million were starved. And the only way to know the answer to that is to perform some kind of data work. That those numbers are not simply available. One has to go through actually pretty complicated exercises to figure out that the correct number is about 3.9 million. So these things are done. Or people who work, if you're doing the history of memorialization, historians count gravestones, and they count what kinds of gravestones use what kinds of images. We count things all the time. Data matters, but the very simple answer is that the data matters as an answer to questions that are posed by humans. So the data itself doesn't pose a question. Like, you ask a question because you care about the answer, I'm guessing, because you're human. We can use data to try to answer the question, but the questions are always going to be human questions, and the answers are going to be human. And actually, in my view, like, the availability of the technologies we have now has to make us more aware of the human element. Because what tends to happen when people think the data itself can answer the question is that we ask bad questions, or we ask questions carelessly, and then the data comes back with an answer, and we don't notice that the bad question is reflected in the answer. And so, in a way, like, the more powerful our tools are, the more careful we have to be about the questions that we're asking. I want to give a positive example, though, of this, which is precisely ancient DNA. And ancient DNA is a fantastic example of how, of the meeting of our world with an ancient world, because these people whose skeletons we're scraping for their DNA from Ukraine, how did we find their skeletons? Well, we found their skeletons because they were elites. Are there any archaeologists out here to like get angry at me? All right, good. We find their skeletons because they were elites buried in a kurgan, right, or kurhan. They were in a raised burial. They were in a place where you can see them. And why do you bury your elites? Why do you put attention to them? Why do you put them in a kurgan? Because you want people to know how important they were, right? That's very human. Like, okay, this is our guy. He was very important. He was our chieftain. We're going to bury him with a horse and some armor, maybe with the bones of some people he killed, you know. And we want to draw attention to that. Very human. And then 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years later, people in the 21st century say, okay, we're paying attention. Yes, thank you for your patience. Exactly. We're paying attention. We found these bones. And while we're here, we're just going to do a little bit of scraping of these bones. And we're going to send a bit of this material to a laboratory in Copenhagen or maybe Harvard. And we're going to find out who you were. We're going to find out who you were. We're going to find out where your DNA came from, because we were doing it to you and to a few thousand other people. And now it's up in the maybe in the hundreds of thousands now. It's at least in the tens of thousands. And so we have this data, the incredible database of ancient DNA from teeth and from skulls mainly. And we often have these bones because some human wanted to be remembered. And here we are remembering them in our 21st century way. And this generates a huge amount of data. But what do you do with this data, right? So, and this is a really interesting story, because the David Reich and his lab at Harvard, the lab in Copenhagen, they don't know what questions to ask of this data. The questions all come from the humanities. The hypotheses about what the data would mean, how it fits together, all come from decades of debates among archaeologists, historical philologists, anthropologists. Not really historians. This is before our time. And so when you read the articles in Science and Nature, it's fabulously interesting because it's mostly the data and how the data was processed. But if you read carefully, you realize the hypotheses in these papers are all coming from the humanities or from archaeology. So they're in the story that I'm trying to tell about how important tech is and data, you just fold back one layer and you realize the questions that are being asked are coming from somewhere else. So my answer is, like, no matter how much data we have, the questions are always going to come from somewhere else. They'll always be human questions.
Hi, thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm scared of microphones, and it was amazing to listen to you. Thank you so much. It's very inspiring, and your opinions are, they're definitely very well researched, and it's just great to hear them. 19th century romantics were mentioned in this dialogue, and one of the things that were said about them is that they used to think of the people of the past similar as about themselves, but they themselves consider themselves people who are facing unprecedented challenges. So I think of myself sometimes that way, because social media that you have mentioned being one of your concerns is something, its existence is very much unprecedented right now. So prior in human history, an average human being has never had access to such incredible amounts of information, and this information has never been so rage-baiting, so provoking, so controversial, and it has never changed so fast. We've never had to deal with such insane amounts of news. Say, like yesterday, this week has been insane and absurd. A murder of Ukrainian refugee in the United States, drones in Poland, shooting of Charlie Kirk yesterday, and this is all being accompanied by bazillion of emotional reactions. So my question question is, how do you think the existence of social media and all this insane amount of emotions, how is it directing the course of human history now? How is it affecting it, directing, redirecting, shaping? So that's my question. Thank you.
I'm going to answer that, but I'm first going to say that it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and my best reflections are in chapter 2 of my Freedom book. This is what chapter 2 of my Freedom book is all about. Not that you have to go read it, it's just that it's going to be better than what I'm going to be able to do off the cuff. It relates to this question about data too, because data can be used against us, and that's essentially what social media is. We are in a trap. We are in a trap made by arrogance about our own rationality. So we would like to think about ourselves that we are rational. The world might not be rational. Thunderstorms might not be rational. Animals might not be rational. Maybe babies are not rational. But we are rational. And that as people, I think broadly of a culture that we probably broadly share, that is our trap. That is our starting point. If you think that you're rational, then you think that what you're doing is in your own interest. So and we learn this in economics class. I'm sorry, is this a business school? We learn this in economics class. We learn in Econ 101 or whatever that people have interests, they have preferences. We don't inquire about the deeper sources of this. We treat our preferences as the baseline reality. That's because we're fundamentally rational. There is no deeper reality. And of course, this is a trap because, yeah, we can be, I would say reasonable, but we can be reasonable sometimes. I think, frankly, it's not very often. It takes a lot of work and usually involves listening to somebody else, but we can be reasonable. The idea that we're rational all the time as a default is, I think, a delusion, and it's a delusion which makes us manipulable. Because if we think we're rational all the time, then we don't recognize how important our fears are. We don't recognize how important our desires are. We don't recognize how important the things are that aren't about the everyday choices. I've been thinking a lot about a paragraph in Shestov, who's from Kyiv, by the way, where he's arguing against Husserl, and he says, and I think Shestov is 100% right, he says, you can't do philosophy on the basis of everyday choices. Philosophy doesn't really come from the middle ranges of life experiences. It comes from the poles. It comes from the extremes. And it's liminal. This goes back to Volodya's last question in a way, that you are more likely to have insight at extreme moments or unusual moments, moments when you're shaken, moments when you're confronted by the unfamiliar. But we don't want to think about that. We want to think we are the creatures of every day. We're the creatures of consumer choices. But what the data that exists does is that it takes our fears and sometimes our desires, and it uses them to manipulate us. The whole way that social media is quite consciously structured by humans who understand this, it's as a weapon to keep you afraid, occasionally thrilled, afraid, thrilled. It's designed with the data that we release about ourselves. It's designed to keep us pinned down by our fears and by our anxieties. And you're right, and I appreciate the point, to historicize this and to say, well, this is a moment in history. It's not a moment which is beyond history or past history. It is an engagement of humans with a certain kind of technology which is changing us. And that's happened before. Writing certainly changed us. The ability to read the stars, to navigate the oceans changed us. Language going way back certainly changed us. The domestication of the horse changed us. Technologies change us, but here's the rub, not necessarily for the better. And even like if you think of radio, so right now, radio, at least to me, seems like a very calming technology. You put on the radio and you listen to some nice report, or you listen to a story or a sporting event or whatever, and it's one thing and it has a kind of logic and it separates you from the world in a nice way. But in the 1930s, radio was a very disruptive technology, or writing. So again, I'm a big fan of the book. I think books are great. The single best thing you can do to protect yourself from social media is to read books, and keep books by your bed, not your phone. But there was certainly a time when the printed book was very disruptive. The wars of religion were largely wars of the book. The printing press was incredibly disruptive. Or even writing itself. When you learn to write, and this is more disputed, but when you learn to write and you start to depend upon written material, you lose your ability to memorize things, and our humans lose their poetic capacities. So most of the time that we've had language, we have essentially been about poems and songs, about things that you can remember because of their rhyming quality or their alliterative quality. And for most of the time that we've had language, we have generally been able to remember long bits of text, very long, book-length bits of text. And there are tricks. Poetry is essentially a set of memorization tricks. But we were able to do that until quite recently, right? Even in my father's generation, they were still, and it's not that he's that old, it's whatever. Even in my father's generation, they were still expected to memorize quite a lot of poetry, which would be unthinkable today. And my father's in his 80s and he still remembers it. And I couldn't have done that. I was already much more in a reading culture. So every kind of technology changes us. It changes us, cerebrally. It changes us cognitively. It reformats us. And I think you're very wise to treat that as a historical development. It's not outside of history, beyond history. We're not moving to some new utopia. We're just in a new historical moment, which for me is mostly limiting. Like, I agree with you. I think mostly it limits us because it limits our attention span. It limits our ability to truly understand other people, because on social media, other people are essentially instruments to drive us into a certain emotional state. It limits our ability to engage in the past, to take Volodya's theme for this conversation, because on the internet everything happens, right now. And it also limits, and this is maybe the thing I find the most sad, it limits our ability to remember anything. Like, one of I find the most terrifying things about social media is I think about people, I'm sorry, is this dark, but it's a dark world. I think of people dying and trying to remember their lives and not being able to, because they spent so much time on social media, Like, when you think, what are the things you want to remember? Well, you want to remember humans. Like, we're all going to die, So what do you want to remember? We want to remember humans. We want to remember beautiful things we've read. We want to remember beautiful things we've seen. But things on social media are not as interesting as that, but they have the quality that we don't remember them. They're very intense while they happen, but nobody remembers them. And the data about this is very clear. You don't remember stuff from the screen. It stimulates you, but you don't remember it. Students who go through university using screens, they don't remember anything. And that's a problem. I mean, it's a problem for professors, but it's a problem for life. It's sad. Like, when I used to teach at Yale, and they would have reunions of 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 60 years. And these old guys, and they are guys because Yale didn't take women until the 1970s. So these old guys would come, and they say 70 years, they would say, first of all, because I have gray hair, they'd be like, did you know Professor such and such, who of course died in 1950, but did you know Professor such and such? No, I'm afraid I didn't. And then they would say, well, Professor such and such assigned this book, and they would remember. And my students today, are no doubt at least as bright, but I really worry whether they're going to remember anything, years or decades down the line, and precisely because of social media. So I share your concerns. I think it's helpful to think of it as a historical moment, because if you think of it as a historical moment, then you can start to get some distance on it, denature it, don't think of it as natural, start to find some analogies, and start to think about, well, what are the values that we actually want to preserve, as opposed to treating that as inevitable. Like, the inevitability of it is something I really worry about. The stories about how, in one way or another, well, social media is a step towards something else, artificial intelligence, brains in vats, it's a step towards something else, and that something else is either, not going to happen or worse than what we actually have. So I really share your concern, and it's not a concern which is disconnected from this war, at least in my view. Like, when I wrote an earlier book, some of you might know, called Road to Unfreedom, and I was I saw the first invasion of Ukraine, 2014, as an example of what happens when social media begins to colonize reality. And with this war, things are no better. The Russians didn't have as good propaganda when they invaded in 2022 as they did in 2014, because they thought they were going to win very quickly. But with time, of course, they've come up with the algorithms, they've come up with the memes, they've come up with the images, and you can see how the Western conversation is slowly being changed, not by what happens on the battlefield, which is very incidental, but by what happens on social media.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we need to close now. We need to go to another event. But thank you very much for being here, for spending your time, for your wisdom. Thank you.
This was Thinking in Dark Times, a podcast of reflection from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Timothy Snyder, a prominent American historian. Let me remind you that you can support our work on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to continue our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas of Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all relevant links in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.